We're 21 seconds in. And, one of the things they tell you on here when you're doing live broadcasts is that they encourage you to engage your audience so that you don't leave a huge gaping hole of silence during your broadcast. It's the most scientific thing, Every little move, every little nuance is measured, recorded, and timed. So we all have to do our part to make sure that our audience is engaged. Ms. K, good morning to you, Ms. Ms., please tell me in the comments below if you can hear me so that we can get this show on the road. Remember a while ago, I told you about some MAC products. So I was putting on the makeup. This was a few minutes before I clicked the live button. And then I realized that as we say in Zambia, as I was applying the makeup. Hey, Cyber Hygiene Zambia. Thank you, Cyber Hygiene, for being with us. Steph Junza. What's up, big man? What's up to you, Steph? Please tell me the loud and clear, somebody said. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Thank you for taking the time to join me for a few minutes as we talk about this case that's going on over there in the States, in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I'm assuming it's Minnesota. I've never been to Minnesota. I don't think so. I don't think I've been to Minnesota. And we're talking about the George Floyd case. Let me begin, first of all, by reminding you of this case here. Do you remember this case, the O.J. Simpson trial? Back in 1984, some of you weren't even born in 1994. Some of you didn't even exist in 1994. I was a young man living in Baton Rouge, Louisiana in 1994 when O.J. Simpson, the famed Hall of Fame football player, when I say football, I'm talking about American football, an African-American football hero and legend that had been accused of killing his wife, Nicole Brown Simpson, along with her friend, Ron Goldman. And when the news first came out that these two people were dead, had been killed, suspect number one was O.J. Simpson. And I'll never forget, after the bodies were discovered, O.J. Simpson was interviewed, and then all of a sudden he fled. Remember that? He fled in a vehicle that is now referred to as the white Bronco. A Bronco is a type, it's a brand of car. I imagine it's an SUV, okay? Service utility vehicle. That's what SUV stands for. Well, O.J. Simpson, with a gun in hand, attempted to evade the law, and he went down trying to escape, I guess, with police cars following him behind. And we all watched this on CNN. This was before Facebook, before the internet, before social media, before the internet as we know it today. In those days, we were watching it live, and it seemed like the whole country was watching the Bronco chase. And then finally, they caught up with O.J. Simpson. The talk at the time was, and of course, we were watching all of this in real time. Real time meaning we were watching it as it was unfolding, as it was happening. The information that was coming through the tube, the television, or the news, was that OJ had a gun and could possibly kill himself. And we were all sitting at the edge of our seats because we weren't sure, is he going to blow his brains out? Is he? Well, finally, they finally apprehended him, and he went to trial. In 1994, went to trial for the murder, for the double murder of his wife, Nicole Brown Simpson, and her friend, Ron Goldman. For almost a year, a little over a year, actually, we watched this trial. This was the first time we'd seen a courtroom proceeding of this magnitude. We had never seen anything like this before. So the whole nation was held spellbound. So I think it was in October 1995 was the conclusion of the OJ trial. And I'll never forget, I was there in 1995, and everybody was with bated breath. We were waiting to hear the final verdict. Would OJ Simpson be found guilty or innocent? And the racial tension was palpable. It seemed to me, and of course, I was in the middle because I'm a young boy. I was a young boy from Zambia. I wasn't an African American. I wasn't a white person. I was in the middle. But I found it so interesting and curious that every single, without exception, of course, this is not in every case because I'm just saying to you that the people I spoke to, I found it so curious that every single African American I spoke to felt that O.J. Simpson had been framed. O.J. Simpson was innocent. O.J. Simpson, in their eyes, did not commit this horrible crime. And then every white person I spoke to was absolutely sure, without a doubt in their minds, that O.J. Simpson had killed Ron Goldman and his wife, Nicole Brown Simpson. I found that so strange, and I found that curious. So finally, the verdict was announced, and it was like watching a movie. The moment they said O.J. Simpson was acquitted, he was acquitted of double murder, the entire African American community erupted in a crescendo of celebration. The entire white community lowered their heads in sadness and grief. I found that so strange. Most people you spoke to, even though they touted the racial line, most people were convinced that given the evidence, given O.J. Simpson's history, he in fact did kill Nicole Brown Simpson. The system failed to prove that because you had people like Johnny Cochran, who's the late now, who was the lead lawyer on O.J. Simpson's team, did a fantastic job of casting doubt, playing the race card, and just muddling that whole case. But in hindsight, looking back, we all know, even then I knew, this was my opinion, I knew O.J. killed those two people. He did. Fast forward to today. We have a case now. When I say we, I'm talking about the world. I'm not speaking as an American citizen because I'm not. I'm a Zambian watching the case on CNN and all these other news outlets. Fast forward to today, we have a case of George Floyd. The curious case of George Floyd, an African-American man who walked into a store in the city of Minneapolis, Minnesota, and he took out a counterfeit $20 bill. He took out a fake note, gave it to the cashier, and attempted to buy something with a counterfeit note. Now, here's the thing, guys. It is against the law. It is against the law, as far as I know, in any country to attempt to pass off a counterfeit note as a legitimate note. That right there is against the law. And so the young man, the young cashier that was on duty that day, he took the note, looked at it, and given his experience as a cashier, I mean, that wasn't his first day as a cashier. I imagine he'd been working there for a while. So he knew what a real dollar bill looked like as opposed to a fake dollar bill. So he suspected nothing to do with race, nothing to do with profiling, as far as we know, but everything to do with his experience as a cashier. He looked at the note and he deduced, he assumed, this note is fake. Let me alert the police, which is what any law-abiding citizen would do that was in that position. He called the police. The police responded. George Floyd was confronted by the police. Now, this is where it gets muddy. Okay, and this is where I want to pause for a moment and just mention here very quickly. The police are wonderful people, but if you're on the wrong side of the law, they are demons to you. Let me say that again. Law enforcement, the police, are wonderful people, but when you are on the wrong side of the law, to you, they become demons. But to the rest of society, the police are there to keep law and order, to keep the peace, to keep us safe. Now, of course, we know there's no such thing as a perfect police officer. Just because you wear a badge and you wear a uniform doesn't mean that you are above reproach. Doesn't mean that you're perfect. Doesn't mean that you do everything above board. God forbid, no, far from it. But by and large, the vast majority of law enforcement, of course, you have a few bad apples, whether it's here at ZP, whether it's in Bogota, Colombia, whether it's in New Orleans, Louisiana. Doesn't matter where you are. You'll always find bad cops amongst a batch of good cops. But my point is this. When you are on the wrong side of the law, to you, the police look like demons. And so George Floyd was confronted by the police. And we've all seen this. We've all seen the video. We've all seen the footage. And what's interesting about this case is that we are now, for the first time, seeing footage from a different perspective and footage that we had not seen before. We're now seeing as the courtroom case plays itself out. We now know that George Floyd was confronted by the police and he resisted arrest. Now, let me pause there for a moment because therein lies the conundrum. Now, of course, we know that if you've ever been to America, you know that there is such a thing as white privilege and profiling. If you are an African-American man or an African-American or a person of a minority, okay, usually, not all the time, usually the police profile you. They're apprehensive. They're not sure. And yes, on the other side of that coin, there is such a thing as white privilege. Sometimes a white person gets away with something that a black person would not get away with. There are many cases where a police officer will calmly walk over to a white person and ask them nicely, are you, what's going on here? And then there are other times, of course, it doesn't happen in every case, but my point is it does happen. And then there are cases where the police are just jittery around African Americans based on their experience, I guess. So there was an element of profiling in this case, but the bottom line is that the police responded to a call. There's a young man that's trying to pass off a $20 note as real. It's counterfeit. Please respond. They responded. When they confronted George Floyd, the truth is, George Floyd resisted arrest. And therein lies the conundrum. There was the problem. Guys, the rule is very simple. Resistance is futile, especially when you're dealing with law enforcement. When you resist the police, you heighten the anxiety. You cause a really big problem. And, you know, it's so funny. I can only give you my personal experience. I lived in the States for about 6 years. And I think in the time that I was there, I encountered the police about 3 times. For some reason, and this is not something my father taught me or, you know, my peers told me. I guess it was just innate. In me, I knew that when you're talking to a police officer, be respectful, do what he says. The police officer says, step out of the car, step out of the car. If the officer says, turn around, turn around. If the officer says, spread him, spread him. Just do what the officer says. There's a word for it in law enforcement. It's called comply. Comply. When you comply, you significantly reduce the anxiety. I mean, just that one act, just that one thing, just that one element. You do what the officer says. You have significantly brought down the levels of anxiety, the levels of tension, the levels of potential danger, just from that one thing when you comply. George Floyd didn't do that. George Floyd resisted arrest. He pushed back. Now, this is what George Floyd claimed. This is the reason he resisted arrest. He was claustrophobic. You know this word, claustrophobic? Do you know this? It means you have a fear of small spaces. There are people like that. There are people, they don't like tiny spaces. You know, when you walk, there are people that don't like walking into an elevator. They're claustrophobic. They get scared. All of a sudden, they're overcome with fear and trepidation when they are confined in a small, tight space. They're called claustrophobic. A person that is claustrophobic is a person that fears tight spaces. George Floyd said, I'm claustrophobic. Now, here's the thing. With the police, that doesn't fly. The police don't care. What they're concerned about is making sure that they're safe and the environment is safe. That's all they care about. They're not going to listen to you, especially when you're resisting arrest. They won't listen to you. So you cause a problem. You set in motion a series of events that could potentially end up being devastating. And in this case, because George Floyd resisted arrest and the police officers suspected that George Floyd was on some type of drug or some type of, you know, what do they call it? What's the word? Was under the influence. That's right. The police suspected that George Floyd was under the influence of something. In their minds, they had to contain him. And unfortunately, the method of containing him ultimately led to George Floyd's life. Now, of course, we're not We're not justifying, I certainly am not justifying the death of George Floyd. I think this case is going to change the way law enforcement engages the public. I think that technique of kneeling on someone's neck for 9 minutes, was it 9 minutes, 29 seconds? Correct me in the comments below if I'm wrong. The police officer that knelt on George Floyd's neck, obstructing his passageway, did so for about 9 minutes, some odd seconds. I'm thinking that after this George Floyd case, the American and law enforcement have to reimagine and rethink how they engage the public when it comes to apprehension. That's what this case will do. But the issue here, in my view, did that officer murder George Floyd? No, he didn't. He was doing his job. He was trying to contain someone who had resisted arrest. Let's not lose sight of that. You are wrong when you confine this to when you play the race card with this, which in America is very easy to do. You know, many of the people I'm looking at on this CNN court live coverage, they're crying on the stand. You've got one dispatcher there, some lady that was crying. But this is the thing. When you set in motion a series of events, you have to look at the whole picture. You can't just look at the piece of the pie, a piece of the cake, and just take that one piece. You have to look at it comprehensively. So in my view, two things. Number one, we cannot say that the officer used excessive force, because the issue was George Floyd resisted arrest. And when you resist arrest, big problem, huge problem. The police will subdue you. They will do everything within their power to control you. They will do everything at their disposal to vanquish you. In their minds, you cannot overcome them. That uniform they wear will overcome you. Every single time. That's how the police think. When the cops are wearing that uniform, that's what's foremost in their minds. If you don't comply, I will subdue you, I will contain you, and I will confine you. That's the issue. He shouldn't have resisted. Looking back, looking at the footage, looking at who he was, and of course, George Floyd had a record. But the bottom line is, he shouldn't have resisted. He would be alive today if he did exactly what those police officers asked him. But he resisted. And unfortunately, he paid the price for it. That is my view. So the bottom line is, I don't think the officer murdered him. I think in the line of duty, the officer used excessive force. But that was because he was trying to subdue him, number one. Number two, George Floyd should not have resisted arrest. What do you think? Tell me in the comments below. See what you guys are saying. Shanique, they are trained and know which parts of the body will cause damage. So I don't agree here that he didn't mean to kill him. Yes, he didn't mean to, but why be on his neck for so long? Yeah. Salome, I don't agree with you. Well, that's your opinion, and you're entitled to it. Nora, on this one, but I don't agree with you. That officer used excessive force when the threat was already neutralized by being handcuffed. The officer is responsible for his death. Interesting observation. It's also important to note here, in all fairness, even after George Floyd was handcuffed, he was still resisting. Big mistake, man. Big, huge mistake. Don't resist the police. Just do what they ask you to do. Now, I'm not naive. I'm not saying every officer out there is a good person. They're not. There's some bad people out there that wear a badge and uniform. But for every bad person, I bet you there are 100 really good cops out there. My opinion. Muila. None would have happened if he never resisted arrest. Would still be alive by now. I agree with that. I really do. My second, 9 minutes, 25 seconds. Breathe. The video shows him going limp and being carried away by the police. Yes, unfortunately. Unfortunately. Chandwe, Mr. Mwewa, I beg to differ. He didn't deserve to die like that. Before I finish reading your comment, nobody's saying he deserved to die. I certainly didn't say that. If that's what you're getting from my address, then you've completely misunderstood me. I didn't say George Floyd deserved to die. I didn't use that word. That word, deserved to die, changes the whole narrative. He was already in cuffs. Why did they have to kneel on him? Well, if you watch the footage, he was in cuffs, but he was still resisting arrest. Guys, the rule is simple. When the officer cuffs you and he says to you, get in the car, get in the car. When the officer cuffs you and says, sit down, sit down. It'll be to your advantage. You may get to live. But if you resist, guys, you must understand this. American police officers are not like Zambian cops. You see, here's the difference between a Zambian cop and an American cop. When a Zambian cop wakes up in the morning and goes to work, he or she could potentially walk into a lucrative situation. Fill in the blanks. But when an American cop wakes up and goes to work, he or she could potentially walk into a deadly situation. Those guys over there live on the edge of death every single day. It's not like our cops over here. The Zambian cop is not worried about dying every day or every second of his working life. Over there, one slight move, you're gone, mate. You're dead. They don't mess around over there. I mean, there's some bad people. There's some really bad people out there. I'm serious. I don't mean to laugh. I don't know why I giggled right there. There's nothing funny about that. Goodness. Yeah. Ms. K, sad truth, unfortunately. Again, here. Pops. He didn't deserve to die. Nobody's saying he deserved to die. Am I speaking French? Am I speaking Hutu or Tutsi? Nobody's saying he deserved to die. Okay. Guys, all right, I gotta go. Thanks for watching, and thank you for contributing. God bless. Bye.